His brother's last breath came with a promise he never expected. Then came the knock. She was taller than any woman he'd seen. Her first words weren't a plea but a vow. "I'm your wife now." The knock came just before dusk, when the sun bled low across the plains and shadows stretched long like sorrow over the dust. Abram Callahan hadn't expected visitors, not after burying his brother just 3 days ago beneath the crooked oak behind the barn. He hadn't spoken more than a few words since. The world had gone still around him, as if grief itself had stolen sound from the wind. The second knock was heavier, not urgent, but solid, like someone knocking not just on wood, but on the door to something they already believed was theirs. Abram stood from the kitchen table, his knees stiff, his chest hollow. The shovel still leaned by the door, dried with the earth that had covered Isaac's grave. He hesitated, then unlatched the door and pulled it open. She filled the frame. A woman, no, a figure of towering strength stood in the fading light, shoulders broad as any ranch hand's, thick arms wrapped in faded denim, her shadow pooling over the porch like spilled ink. Her eyes were pale blue, sharp and calm, set beneath a strong brow and dark, wind-blown hair braided down her back. A bag was slung across one shoulder. Her boots were muddy from miles. "I'm your wife now," she said. Abram blinked. For a moment he thought grief had finally broken something loose in his mind. He'd barely managed a life on his own, barely managed to keep Isaac alive toward the end, and now here stood this mountain of a woman speaking in vows. "Name S. Marigold," she added after a breath, voice low and sure. "Your brother sent for me." He didn't move. The silence stretched long between them. "I got the letter," she said. "He said he was dying, said he wanted to make sure you weren't alone after." Abram's fingers curled slightly around the doorframe. The wind stirred behind her, brushing the dust off the porch, and for a moment all he could think of was Isaac's face in those last hours. How he'd gripped Abram's wrist with what little strength he had left and whispered, "You won't make it alone. She's common. Let her in." He hadn't understood what that meant. Isaac had been slipping in and out of sense toward the end. Abram had figured he meant some widow from town to stop by, bring a pie, say a prayer. Not this. "I came as fast as I could," she added, eyes narrowing slightly, as if preparing herself to be turned away. "You want proof." "No," Abram said hoarsely, stepping back. "Come in." She ducked beneath the frame and stepped inside, her head brushing the top beam, the scent of dust, leather, and pine following her like a second shadow. She moved with the kind of grace that didn't match her size, steady, deliberate, like someone who knew exactly how to carry weight and not just her own. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, cramped. Abram watched her set her bag by the hearth without a word, then glance around the room. "Didn't think you'd actually want me," she said quietly. "I didn't know you were real," he replied. They stared at each other. Something fragile passed between them, unsaid but understood. Neither of them had asked for this. But here they were. Marigold rolled up her sleeves and walked to the stove like she'd done it 1,000 times. She opened it, checked the firebox, then grabbed a log from the stack beside it. The way she moved, it was clear she wasn't used to sitting still. "You hungry?" she asked. He was, but he nodded. She boiled water, opened a tin, got soup started with hands that moved confidently, efficiently, like this wasn't the first home she'd walked into, but maybe the first she'd been asked to stay in. "I don't know how to do this," Abram muttered after a while. "Neither do I," she replied without looking back. They ate in silence. The wind outside picked up, but inside the cabin it was warm, solid. Abram watched her hands. Big, scarred, work-worn. Not the delicate fingers most men dreamed of wrapping around their own, but they looked steady, capable. "I buried him Tuesday," he said. Marigold stopped chewing, bowed her head slightly. "I'm sorry. He never told me he sent for you. He said you'd fight it if he did." Abram gave a bitter laugh. He was right. She looked up then, her eyes quiet but unwavering. Then don't fight. Just let me stay until the frost lifts. What happens then? She shrugged. If you want me gone, I'll go. If not, I'll be your wife for real. He didn't answer. He just nodded slowly, not because he agreed, but because he couldn't think of a single reason not to. Not after what the last winter had done to him. Not with the quiet way Marigold held herself, as if she knew how to fight off cold and loneliness and loss, and maybe wouldn't mind fighting them off with him. That night she slept on the floor by the hearth, rolled in her own bedroll, Boots beside her. Abram lay awake on his cot, staring at the beams above, listening to the sound of her breathing. She didn't snore. He'd expected her to. In the morning the frost was thick on the window panes, but Marigold was already up, already splitting wood out back. Abram watched from the kitchen window as her axe fell clean and heavy, splitting logs like they were kindling. There was no performance to it, no need to prove anything. She simply did what needed doing. He stepped outside and she nodded to him without pausing. You got a winter root cellar. Half dug, he admitted. She stopped then, leaned on the axe handle. I'll finish it. You don't have to. You got any plans to survive winter without one? He shook his head. Then I do. And that was that. They worked together all day. She took the heavier loads without comment. He handled the smaller tools. She didn't talk much, and neither did he, but by sundown the cellar was done, the woodpile stacked twice its height, and the barn swept clean. Abram couldn't remember the last time the place had looked so ready. Over dinner he asked, Where are you from? Montana, she replied. Lived near Fort Benton. Parents died when I was 17, been working ranches since. You ever been married? She shook her head. Your brother was the first to ask. Why'd you say yes? Her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Because he said you were kind, and I didn't want to die alone. Abram stared at her. He said I was kind. She gave a small, dry smile. He lied about a lot of things, didn't he? That made him chuckle despite himself. Later, they sat by the fire. Marigold pulled out a small notebook from her bag and flipped through pages filled with neat handwriting. She caught him looking. Letters, she said, from Isaac. Can I see? She hesitated, then handed it over. Abram read quietly. Isaac's handwriting was uneven near the end, but the words were steady, thoughtful. He spoke of Abram, of how he'd failed him, of how this woman, this stranger, might be the only way to make it right. And at the bottom of one page, scrawled in ink that had bled from shaking hands, were the words, Tell him not to push her away. She's stronger than both of us. Abram closed the book slowly. Marigold didn't look at him. She just stared into the fire like it held something she couldn't reach. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters, and Abram realized for the first time in a long time. He wasn't dreading tomorrow. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm neither of them questioned. It wasn't ease exactly, but something like it. The way-worn boots fit better after enough miles. Marigold rose with the dawn, often earlier, and was already chopping, hauling, or stitching by the time Abram rubbed sleep from his eyes. She didn't ask what needed doing, she just did it. When a hinge groaned, she oiled it. When a fence leaned, she set it straight. When Abram muttered about a soft spot in the roof, she was on the ladder with a hammer before he finished the sentence. He tried to help where he could, but he saw how she watched him. Not in a mocking way, never that, but like she was measuring what he could carry without breaking. By the fourth morning, Abram didn't flinch when she sat at his table uninvited. He poured her coffee like it was normal, like it had always been that way. She nodded thanks, and he noticed how her hands, thick-fingered and weathered, always wrapped fully around the cup, never dainty, never cautious. There was no pretending in her, no shrinking herself to suit a man. She didn't belong in any world that asked her to. That morning, the wind had dropped, and the sky broke open to a pale, brittle blue. Marigold stood out front with a shovel, scraping the last of the frost melt from the path, when Abram came around the corner of the barn with a question caught between his teeth. "Why'd you come all this way?" he asked finally, voice rough. She didn't turn to look at him, just said, "Because I don't walk away when someone calls." "You didn't know me." "I didn't need to." She set the shovel against the post, wiping sweat from her brow with her sleeve. "Your brother said something about you that mattered, that you stayed when he didn't deserve it. That's rare." Abram kicked at a clump of ice. "He left a lot of things undone." Marigold gave a faint, knowing smile. "So did mine." She didn't elaborate, neither did he, but the silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was something else. A shared weight neither of them needed to explain. Around midday, they rode into town together. Abram needed nails, flour, and a new axe head. Marigold rode behind him on a borrowed mule, silent, hands steady on the reins, eyes scanning every face that turned toward them. And they all turned. Hickory Bend wasn't the sort of place to welcome new folks without a dozen questions, and Marigold wasn't the sort of person to arrive unnoticed. As they tied their mounts near the general store, heads turned like weather vanes. Murmurs followed them down the plank walk. "Is that a woman?" someone whispered. "No woman ought to look like that," said another. Marigold ignored them. She walked in behind Abram, taller than nearly every man there, shoulders brushing door frames. When the bell chimed over the store door, the owner, Mr. Hobb, nearly dropped his ledger. Abram kept his voice level. "Need a dozen nails, 2 pounds flour, and a number 3 axe head." Mr. Hobb nodded, barely glancing at the items as he fetched them. "And your companion?" "Wife," Marigold said before Abram could speak. "Name's Marigold Callahan." You could have heard a pin drop. Hobb blinked, then smiled with the kind of politeness that came with discomfort. "Well, welcome, Mrs. Callahan." She gave a short nod. "Thanks." As they walked out, Abram said nothing. He waited until they were 3 buildings down before murmuring, "You didn't have to say that." "I did," she replied. "They were gonna ask. Best answer's the one they can't argue with." He didn't disagree. That night, after stew and chores and a quiet hour spent sharpening blades by the fire, Abram asked, "You mind being called that, Callahan?" Marigold looked up from her carving. She was working on a block of ashwood, whittling slow with small, precise movements. "It's not the worst name I've been given," she said. "What was the worst?" She looked at him, then really looked. "One I didn't choose." He nodded slowly and left it there. The next week passed with the kind of rhythm grief makes, slow, steady, often interrupted by memory. Abram caught himself pausing by the stable, expecting Isaac to walk out with that half-grin and cocky gait. He'd hear a creak in the house and think it was his brother dragging his bad leg across the floor. But it was Marigold now, always her, moving with purpose, filling in gaps without even trying. It unsettled him, how quickly the cabin stopped feeling empty. But the peace didn't last. On the 8th day, just as dusk crept in and dinner cooled on the table, a rider came, fast, kicking up a tail of dust so thick it looked like smoke. Abram and Marigold stood together on the porch as the rider galloped straight to their fence, reined in hard, and leapt down in one motion. It was Sheriff Boone. Gray-bearded and square-jawed, Boone wasn't a man to stir up trouble without cause. But he didn't tie his horse or remove his gloves, just marched up the path and stopped 5 feet from them. "We need to talk," he said. Marigold crossed her arms. Abram stepped forward. "What's wrong?" Boone's gaze flicked toward Marigold and then back to Abram. "It's about your brother." Abram felt the hair on his neck rise. "He's dead, Boone." "I know, and I'm sorry, but before he passed, he took something that wasn't his." "What?" Boone hesitated. "A deed. Belonged to a man named Walton, 40 acres east of here. Isaac sold it to someone, but it wasn't his to sell. Abraham's mouth went dry. Why come to me? Because Walton's boy is back in town, says he wants the land or payment, and your name's still tied to the property. I didn't. Boone raised a hand. I know you didn't, but the boy's not looking for truth. He's looking for blood. Marigold stepped forward then. What kind of man is he? Boone's lips tightened, the kind that smiles while lighting a fuse. Abraham nodded slowly. Thanks for the warning. Keep your rifle close, son, and your doors locked. Boone tipped his hat and rode off, dust trailing behind him. Inside, the stew had gone cold. Neither of them touched it. He's coming, Abraham said, staring at the wall. Marigold nodded. Then we'll be ready. You don't have to stay. I know, she replied, standing tall by the fire. But I already said I was your wife. He looked up at her. You meant it. She shrugged. I don't say things I do mean. Outside, the wind picked up again. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled. But inside the cabin, the air held still. Marigold stood like stone, unshakable, while Abraham felt something inside him shift. Not trust. Not yet. But something just as dangerous. Hope. And far off behind the hills, a fire burned. A warning, a promise. The fire on the ridge burned until dawn. Abraham didn't sleep. Neither did Marigold. They took turns watching the hills through the front window, rifles within reach, the quiet between them no longer awkward but thick with the weight of what was coming. Abraham had seen the Walton boy once, years back. Reuben Walton, mean-eyed and lean, with a mouth too fast and fists too fast to follow. Isaac had never gotten along with him. Now he understood why. Marigold didn't speak much that night. She simply moved with calm intention, oiling hinges, checking locks, preparing the rifle with measured care. At one point she disappeared out back. When she returned, her hands were dusted with clay and ash. Pitched the fire low, she said. Made it look like we're sleeping, but we'll watch from the barn. They come, they won't expect us ready. Abraham nodded, the realization settling in deeper. She wasn't just strong. She was clever, practical, the kind of person you wanted next to you when things fell apart. They crouched in the loft of the barn for hours, breath visible in the cold, horses restless below. The view from the slats gave them just enough of the cabin's front and the trail beyond. Abraham found himself glancing at her more than once, not to say anything, but because she seemed so still, so focused. Not like someone waiting for danger, but someone who had already met it before and knew how it moved. When dawn came without incident, Marigold shifted slightly, cracking her back. Nothing, he whispered. She shook her head. Not yet. They came down from the loft and walked the perimeter. No hoofprints, no broken branches, nothing disturbed. But that didn't mean they were safe. It meant the Walton boy was waiting for something, a better angle, a weaker moment. Marigold leaned on the fence, gazing toward the eastern ridge. He'll wait until he thinks we're soft again. Then we won't be. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. You ever kill a man, Abraham? He hesitated. No. She nodded as if she already knew. Let's hope we don't start this week. They kept busy that day. There was still work to do, and neither of them liked the taste of idleness. Abraham repaired the feed trough. Marigold salted meat for the coming winter. When he looked over, she was wrist-deep in salt, eyes steady, lips pressed in a thin line. You always this calm? He asked. She glanced up. You ever seen a fire jump fences? Yeah. That's what panic does, makes things worse. That night Abraham didn't light a lamp. They ate by the firelight, quiet and alert. Marigold set a kettle on for tea, her own blend from a pouch she'd kept in her bag. Mint, a little sage, dried apple skin, she explained. Good for sleep. He drank it without comment. It was bitter but comforting in a way he couldn't explain, like medicine that knew what it was doing. They didn't sleep in the loft that night, too tired, too worn, but they kept the rifle between them just in case. Abram stared at the ceiling for a long time, his thoughts loud in the stillness. "You believe in God?" he asked softly. Marigold didn't move. "Yes." "Even after all this?" She turned her head slightly. "Especially after all this." He didn't reply, just let her words settle into the silence. By morning the first threat arrived. It was Walton. It was a note, tied to their front gate with twine stiff with dew. Abram saw it first and pulled it free with a slow hand. The handwriting was sharp and uneven. "You got 3 days to give it back, or I take what's mine. R.W." He passed it to Marigold without a word. She read it once, then again. "He wants the land," she muttered, "but he won't stop there." "No." Marigold folded the note and tucked it in her pocket. "Let's see what we're working with." They walked the property together. Abram hadn't walked the boundaries in weeks, not since before Isaac passed. It stretched long and lean, past the cornfield, across the dry creek bed, then up the ridge toward a thicket of old pines. Isaac had let some fences rot. One post leaned like a drunk man. Marigold saw it, nodded, and marked it with a strip of cloth from her sleeve. "We'll reinforce here first," she said. They spent the day driving stakes, tightening wire, hammering boards. By the time the sun dipped low, they'd sealed the weakest side. But even as they worked, Abram couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the fence Walton was planning to test. It was them. That night they slept in shifts. Marigold took first watch. When Abram rose just before dawn to relieve her, he found her already sharpening a blade beside the fire. "Couldn't sleep," she said simply. They watched the window together, waiting for the light to rise. But when it did, there was no Walton. Instead, there was something worse. The barn had been burned. Not fully, but enough. The east wall charred, scorched black, a bucket still smoldering nearby. The horses were shaken but untouched, the blaze stamped out before it could spread. Marigold stood in the soot, jaw clenched, fingers curled around the axe she hadn't let go of since rising. "He was here," she said. Abram nodded slowly, "and he wanted us to know it." Marigold walked the edge of the damage, then knelt in the ashes. "Boot prints, 2 men, maybe 3. He's not coming alone." "No, and next time he won't leave with just a warning." They doubled the watch, fortified the barn, laid traps in the brush beyond the property line. Marigold knew tricks Abram had never seen, trip lines made of twine and nails, signal bells fashioned from tin scraps, even a hidden trench dug in the high grass. "You always think like this?" Abram asked as they worked. "I learned young," she said. "People who want something usually take it when you're not ready." The third night came fast and cold. Abram felt it in his chest, tight, heavy. He'd lived through hard winters and failed crops, but this was different. This was a storm with hands and eyes and names. As the sun dipped, Marigold came in from the barn and sat beside the hearth, wiping sweat and grime from her brow. Abram poured 2 cups of coffee, strong, bitter, and handed one to her. "I keep thinking I should tell you to leave," he said. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "Then why haven't you?" "Because the truth is, I don't want to face this without you." She didn't smile, just nodded once. "Then we won't." Abram swallowed hard, the words raw in his throat. "If something happens to me." "No," she cut in. "You don't even know what I was going to say. You were going to say if you fall, I should run." He blinked. She leaned in. "I don't run, Abram, I never have. I didn't ride 500 miles to bury another man and start over. I'm here, until the end." Abram looked down at his hands. They trembled slightly. "I didn't ask for any of this," he whispered. "Neither did I," she replied gently. "But maybe we were meant to find what we didn't ask for." They sat in silence again. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, the wind picked up. The last day before the deadline was about to begin. When the knock came, it wasn't on the door. It was on the gate. 3 sharp raps of metal on wood. Abram and Marigold stood at the same time, rifles ready. Through the window, they saw him. Reuben Walton. Tall, lean, dressed in a black coat and a gray hat pulled low. A scar down one cheek like a lightning bolt carved by fate. Behind him, 2 men stood with rifles and hollow eyes. He didn't speak, just waited. Marigold stepped to the door, looked at Abram. "You ready?" she asked. He nodded. They stepped out together. The morning sun hadn't yet cleared the ridge, and frost still clung to the blades of grass when Abram and Marigold stepped out to face the man who'd set fire to their barn and sent threats laced in ink and smoke. Reuben Walton stood like he'd been carved from iron, hands resting casually on the ivory grip of a revolver that wasn't quite holstered. His men flanked him, their eyes dead and cold, rifles hanging loose but ready. Abram didn't speak. He moved slow and steady down the porch steps, his boots creaking against the frost-hardened wood. Marigold walked beside him, tall and unshaken, her presence more defiant than loud words ever could be. She carried her rifle slung across her back, not raised, yet but her hand hovered near the grip. It was a promise, not a threat. Reuben tipped his hat, mock politeness hiding nothing. "Mighty fine morning," he said. Abram stopped 10 feet from the gate. "You've got something to say, say it." Reuben smiled, all teeth and smugness. "I left a note, thought it was clear." "You don't own this land," Abram replied. "Never did, and you know it." Reuben took a step forward, fingers brushing the revolver. "Your brother forged my father's deed, sold something he didn't have rights to. Now he's dead. Convenient." Abram's jaw clenched. "You think I killed him for the land?" "I think you got desperate, and now you're hiding behind a woman who looks like she could toss a plow." Marigold didn't blink, didn't move, just stared straight through him. "You've had your say," she said flatly. "Now go." Reuben let out a low laugh. "Oh, I like her, but I didn't ride all this way for words." He looked past them, toward the cabin, the fields, the line of smoke curling from the chimney. "I came to collect what's mine. You can hand it over or I take it another way." Abram raised his voice, steady now. "The land's under my name. Whatever Isaac did, he did alone. You want a trial, file a claim." Reuben's smile vanished. "I don't do courtrooms, Callahan. I do graves." And then he drew. But Marigold was faster. Her rifle snapped up and cracked like thunder. The bullet hit the ground inches from Reuben's boot, sending dust and frost flying. The 2 men behind him jerked back instinctively, hands twitching toward their weapons. "Next one's not a warning," she said. Reuben's face twisted. "You'll regret that." "I've regretted worse." For a long second, no one moved. Then Reuben lifted his hand and waved the others back. "This ain't over," he said. "You've got till sunset to leave. After that, I don't knock." He turned, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word. The others followed, kicking up dirt and menace behind them. When they were gone, Abram let out the breath he'd been holding. "He's not bluffing," he said. "No," Marigold replied. "He's setting up." They moved fast. No time for panic, just action. Marigold climbed the ridge behind the house and scouted the tree line. She returned with news, hoofprints, fresh ones, circling wide, looking for a blind spot. "They'll wait until dark," she said. "Want to come when we're half asleep." "So we don't sleep." "Right." Abram fortified the cabin, barricaded the windows, reinforced the doors with boards and furniture. Marigold set tripwires at the fence line, scattered nails beneath the porch, placed bottles on posts where wind wouldn't knock them, but a man would. By afternoon, the sky darkened with clouds. Not storm clouds, just that low gray ceiling that felt like a weight pressing the light out of the world. The air turned colder. The wind shifted west. "They'll come from that side," Marigold muttered, eyes scanning the hills. "How do you know?" It's where I'd come from. Inside, the fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls. Abram checked the rifles again, counted bullets. His hands didn't tremble now. He felt different, more grounded, like her strength had seeped into him without asking. Marigold stepped close, not too close, just enough. If this goes wrong. No, he said. Listen to me. He turned to her. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a storm. If this goes wrong, you get out, through the back. There's a trail that leads down the hollow. Follow the creek west until you hit the mill road. Someone'll find you. I'm not leaving you. You will if you want to live. He shook his head. I didn't ask for you. I didn't want this. But now you're here, and I'm not letting another person I care about get buried because I stood back. She didn't argue. Didn't need to. They stood in silence as the sun fell behind the hills. The light bled out of the world slowly, shadows swallowing the valley. The bottles on the posts clinked once. Then again. Marigold grabbed her rifle and slipped to the side window. Abram crouched by the front, peeking through a slat. 3 figures moved through the dusk, slow, calculated. One carried a torch, its flame bobbing like a serpent's tongue. Now, Abram whispered. No, she murmured, let them come closer. The torch flicked toward the barn. The men split, one heading around the right flank, the other left. Reuben stayed in the middle. Marigold moved to the back, covered the rear window. Abram tracked the torchlight, heart pounding. Then, without warning, the left side bottle shattered. Movement fast. Now, she said. Abram kicked the front door open and fired once into the air. Stop. The torch dropped. The man on the left turned toward him, eyes wide. A crack from the back, Marigold's rifle, one down. Another shot, Abram's, missed. The last man turned to run. Marigold cut him off. She stepped out from behind the shed, barrel level, steady as ever. Don't, she said. He froze. Reuben emerged from the tree line, rifle up, fury in every line of his face. But he didn't fire. Abram stepped forward. Enough. You think this is enough, Reuben hissed. You think one night stops what's mine. He raised his rifle. And Marigold shot him. Not in the chest. Not in the head. But in the leg. Reuben dropped like a sack of grain, howling. His men ran. She walked up to him, rifle still aimed. You'll live, she said, but you won't walk right again. You want to come back, you'll do it with a limp and a memory. Reuben spat blood. You ain't law. No, she said, I'm mercy. Sheriff Boone arrived 2 hours later. Someone in town had heard the shots and fetched him. By then, Abram had dragged Reuben to the porch, tied and groaning. Boone took one look and sighed. Tell me you didn't kill him. He's alive, Abram said. He tried to burn us out again. Boone rubbed his face. I'll take him, but you'll have to speak to the judge come spring. We'll be there. Marigold stood behind him, arms crossed. Boone looked at her for a long time. You're a strange woman, he said finally. She nodded. I get that a lot. Boone tipped his hat and hauled Reuben into the wagon. As he rode off, Abram turned to Marigold. You saved us. You saved yourself. They stood under the stars. The wind had died. The land finally was quiet. Inside, the fire still burned. Abram stepped close. You were right, you know. About what? He reached out, took her hand. That maybe we were meant to find what we didn't ask for. She didn't pull away. Didn't speak. Just held on. The weeks that followed weren't quiet, but they were healing. After Reuben was hauled off to the county seat, word spread fast across Hickory Bend and beyond. Some folks nodded quietly when they passed Abram in town, murmuring words like brave or fool beneath their breath. Others looked twice at Marigold. their eyes lingering not with pity but with a kind of wary respect. She had faced down 3 armed men and didn't flinch. She had bled nothing and broken no laws, yet she delivered justice before the sheriff even saddled his horse. People remembered things like that. But Marigold didn't talk about it. Not once. She moved through each day as though none of it had happened, chopping wood, preparing the root cellar, teaching Abram how to set traps in the high grass or how to tell when a snowline was going to break early. She didn't boast, didn't sulk, didn't speak of Reuben at all. Abram noticed. He noticed everything now. He noticed the way she stood still in the early mornings, just watching the horizon, like she was listening for something only she could hear. He noticed how her hand hovered over her hip, even inside the cabin when something clattered too loudly. He noticed how she never let herself sit with her back to a window. One night as they sat by the fire, silence stretching easy between them, Abram finally asked, "You've been running long." She didn't look away from the flames. Not running, watching. Watching for what? She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "For whoever's next." He waited, but she didn't add more. Instead, she stirred the embers with the iron poker and said, "Some people carry bad luck like a coat. Keeps following no matter how many times you burn it." Abram leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You think that's what you are, bad luck?" She turned to him slowly, face calm but firm. "You don't get 3 winters of ranching work while living in a wagon unless you've been turned away more than you've been taken in." He looked down at his hands, the calluses, the lines carved from years of effort. "You're not bad luck, Marigold." She didn't answer, but her eyes softened just a little. After that night, something shifted between them. They didn't talk about it, didn't name it, but it was there. In the way they moved around each other, in how they handed off tools without speaking, in how their eyes met more often, longer each time. Winter came fast that year. The first snow swept in from the north, low and heavy, burying the ground in silence. The wind pushed against the cabin walls, howling like it remembered who had lived there and who had died. But inside, the hearth stayed warm and the shelves stayed full. Marigold had prepared for this, and Abram had followed her lead, learned from her in every step. They were surviving, but more than that, they were enduring. One morning, as the snow fell thick and slow, Abram woke early to find Marigold already dressed, coat buttoned, boots laced. She stood at the door, rifle in hand, staring out into the pale gray. "Something wrong?" he asked, still pulling his shirt over his head. "I saw something last night," she said. "A shape near the tree line, too big for a deer, too low for a man walking." Abram joined her at the window. All he saw were pines weighted with snow and the soft trail of animal prints. "We'll check it," she said, already stepping into the drift. He followed, teeth clenched against the cold. The prints weren't animal after all, boot treads, wide and shallow, disappearing into the trees. They followed the trail for half a mile before finding the remnants of a camp, a cold fire pit. Some branches snapped clean, not from weather but from weight. "Someone was watching," she muttered. "Think it's Reuben's men." She shook her head. "He's in lockup, but that doesn't mean he didn't send word." They destroyed the camp, covered the prints, returned home faster than they'd left. That night, Marigold added another lock to the door. Another week passed without sign, then another. The wind turned cruel. The snow grew deeper. They rationed wood and canned beans and whatever meat Marigold had cured back in September. At night, they sat close to the fire, not touching, but near enough to feel the shared warmth. And then one morning, a letter arrived. A rider from town delivered it, his coat soaked, his beard crusted with ice. "Sheriff Boone sent me," he said it was urgent. Marigold took the letter, her fingers steady even as she broke the seal. She read once, twice, then handed it to Abram. Reuben Walton escaped custody, 2 guards dead, believed to be heading back to Hickory Bend, Be on guard, I'm riding out tomorrow. Boone. Abram lowered the letter slowly. He's coming back. Marigold nodded, and this time he won't knock. They prepared again. Only this time it was different. There was no panic, no fear scrambling under the surface. Abram knew what to do now, knew how to check for weak spots, how to pack snow for sound, how to turn the barn into a fortress if needed. He worked beside her like they'd been building this place for a decade. One night, as they hauled in the last load of wood, Abram stopped beside her. I keep thinking about what you said, about not choosing this life. Marigold didn't look at him, just stacked logs into the bin. He continued, I didn't choose it either. I didn't choose to bury my brother. I didn't choose to inherit a woman I didn't know. I didn't choose this cabin, this land, this fight, but it chose me, and maybe it chose you too. She glanced over then, her face unreadable. What are you saying? He stepped closer. I'm saying maybe we stop surviving and start living, you and me, not out of duty, not because of Isaac's letter, because we want to. She looked at him a long time, then said softly, what if I don't know how? Then we figure it out, together. The silence that followed was heavy, not with tension but with decision. She stepped back inside without a word, but that night she didn't unroll her bedroll by the hearth. She slept in the cot beside his. Clothes not touching, but closer than ever before. The next day, they built a second door. Stronger, braced, as if they both knew that whatever came next would test everything they'd built. And then 2 nights later, the wind shifted. Abram was sitting by the fire, reading the last of Isaac's letters when he heard it, a creak outside. Not wind, not animal. Wood under boots. He stood slowly. Marigold was already moving, rifle in hand, breath measured. They didn't speak. Didn't need to. They moved together, side by side, toward the front door. Abram peeked through the slat. A man stood just beyond the porch. Alone. Coat flapping in the wind. Face in shadow. Reuben, Abram whispered. Marigold stepped in front of him. He came alone, she said. Or wants us to think so. They waited. And then he spoke. I came to talk. Marigold's voice was calm but loud. Then talk from there. I was wrong, Reuben said. I burned your barn, I sent men. I threatened your lives, but I'm done fighting. I want to make peace. Abram narrowed his eyes. You killed 2 deputies. I didn't, Reuben said. They were dead when I got out. I didn't ask for blood. I just wanted what was mine. Marigold didn't flinch. It never was yours. Then let me prove it. Silence again. Then Reuben tossed something onto the porch. A rolled document bound with twine. The real deed, he said. My father signed it over to Isaac years ago. I didn't believe it. I thought it was forged. I was wrong. Why now? Abram asked. Reuben's voice cracked. Because I don't want to die in the snow. Because I got nothing left but shame. Because I've been running since I was a boy and I'm tired. Marigold opened the door slowly, rifle still raised. She stepped out, picked up the document, unrolled it. Signed. Sealed. Real. She looked back at Abram. Then at Reuben. Leave your weapons, come in. He hesitated, but obeyed. He left his gun on the post and stepped inside. The door shut behind Reuben Walton with a groan that echoed longer than it should have. The wind caught it, howling like a warning just a moment too late. Abram stood at the edge of the firelight, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes never leaving the man who had nearly burned his life down. Marigold moved slow and careful, circling the room once as if checking that every shadow was still where it ought to be. Reuben stood in the center, coat damp from frost, cheeks hollow with exhaustion, but his eyes still burned with something fierce, even if it wasn't the same fire that had brought him here the first time. "Put the deed on the table," Marigold said. Reuben obeyed, unrolling the parchment like it weighed more than it should. Abram stepped forward, his boots heavy on the floorboards. The paper was official, yellowed, brittle around the edges, but genuine. Abram scanned the names, the notary stamp, the signature. Isaac Callahan. Dated 4 years prior. "It's real," he said quietly. Reuben nodded. "Told you. That doesn't erase what you did." Reuben didn't flinch. "I know." He moved to the far wall and leaned against it, as far from the hearth as he could manage. He didn't sit, didn't ask to, just stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight. Marigold moved behind Abram, the rifle still within arm's reach but pointed downward. She didn't trust him, not entirely, and made no effort to hide it. Abram didn't either, but the snowstorm pressing against the windows reminded him that sometimes the enemy you know is still a man, hungry, tired, worn thin by bad choices and worse years. "I ain't come here to fight," Reuben said again. "Why now?" Abram asked. "Why not last time?" Reuben looked down at his boots. "'Cause I wasn't done being angry. And now—" Reuben swallowed hard. "Now I'm scared." The fire cracked. The wind hissed through the gaps in the logs. "Scared of what?" Marigold asked. Reuben lifted his eyes. "Of dyin' alone. Of meetin' God with no good left in me. Of spendin' my last breath thinkin' I spent every other one wrong." No one spoke, not for a long time. Finally Abram said, "You need a place to sleep." Reuben nodded once. "You'll take the barn. You move wrong, you move loud, you don't wake up warm, understand?" "I do." Marigold led him out with no further word. Abram watched through the window as they crossed the yard. She pointed toward the hay pile, then stood there, arms crossed, until Reuben unrolled his own blanket and settled into the corner furthest from the animals. She returned 10 minutes later, brushing snow from her shoulders. "You believe him?" Abram asked. "I don't have to," she said. "Snow's too deep to bury a body clean, not tonight." They didn't speak of it again that evening. Instead, Abram read one of Isaac's old journals. Marigold whittled another animal, a fox this time. Her hands moved slower than usual, less precise. Something in her had tightened, not in fear, but in alertness. Abram saw it in the way she kept glancing toward the window. She was waiting. For what, he didn't ask. He was waiting, too. The next morning broke red and gold, the kind of dawn that meant hard cold all day. Reuben didn't knock. He was already splitting wood when Abram stepped onto the porch. Shirt sleeves rolled, cheeks flushed from effort, hands chapped raw. "I owe you," he said. "I didn't say you could work. You didn't say I couldn't." Abram studied him. "Keep stacking." They ate breakfast in silence, Marigold at the stove, Abram reading, Reuben sitting on the floor near the fire like he didn't trust himself with furniture. He didn't ask for coffee, didn't speak unless spoken to, just sat there with the quiet patience of a man carrying more than guilt. Maybe grief too, maybe something worse. After the plates were cleared, Reuben said, "Your brother wrote me once." Abram looked up. "What?" 2 years ago, said he messed up, said he owed me something, promised he'd fix it, never heard back after. Abram rubbed his forehead. That was when he got sick. He wrote a lot of letters after the fever took his legs. "He ever talk about me?" Abram thought for a moment. "Not much, not kindly." Reuben smiled, a bitter twist. Didn't deserve kindness. Marigold set a kettle on. "He said one thing before he passed, told Abram not to push me away, said I was stronger than both of them." Reuben blinked. "He said that?" She nodded. For the first time, Reuben looked small. Not just tired, reduced. Like hearing his enemy speak a word of praise broke something he'd held together too long. The days stretched. Reuben stayed in the barn, helped split wood, never asked for a place at the table, never stepped inside unless invited. But he listened, watched. Every so often, Abram caught him staring at Marigold with a look that wasn't desire, but maybe something close to awe. She didn't flinch under it. She barely noticed. Winter thickened. The snow came hard one morning, rising fast and biting sharp. By midday, they were locked inside again, the barn buried to its windows. Reuben didn't complain, just shoveled paths when the wind allowed. It was during one of those windstorms that it happened. The fire snapped too loud, and the chimney moaned, and something about it cracked Reuben open. He was seated at the table, uninvited but tolerated now, hands wrapped around a tin cup of weak broth. Marigold sat across from him, sharpening her blade. "I ever tell you what happened to my brother?" he asked. Abram looked up. "No," he said. Reuben exhaled slow. "He was younger, sickly. My ma died birthing him, and my pa never looked at him right after, called him cursed. One winter, real bad one, Pa locked him in the feed room because he thought he was bad luck." He paused. "Didn't come out." Marigold stopped her blade. "I found him 2 days too late," Reuben said. "Frozen stiff, clutching, a wooden horse. I carved him when he turned 5. No one spoke. I swore I'd never let someone I cared about freeze again, but I did, over and over, pushed every good thing away. Because Bane alone hurts less than Lawson, M." Marigold said quietly, "Being alone just hurts slower, that's all." Reuben nodded. "I know that now." Abram leaned forward. "Why are you telling us this?" Reuben looked him in the eye. "Because if I die, I want someone to know I tried to make it right." The next day brought no storm. Just silence. Marigold stood out back, watching the sky, when Abram stepped beside her. "He's not staying," he said. "No," she agreed. "But he's not the same man who burned our barn." "No." They stood quietly for a moment. "He said you were stronger than both of us," Abram said softly. Marigold looked at him. "I'm only strong because no one ever offered to carry the weight with me." He reached out, took her hand again. "I'm offering now." And this time she didn't hesitate. That night they let Reuben sit at the table. No ceremony, no toast, just 3 bowls, 3 spoons, and a fire that warmed them all. But when Abram lay down to sleep, he couldn't. The cabin creaked in a way it hadn't before. The stillness wasn't peace. It was waiting. And out in the dark, past the ridge where snow fell soft and slow, someone else was watching. The ridge was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that felt borrowed, like a breath held too long. Abram stood at the back window before dawn, watching the distant line where forest met sky, snow gently drifting down in a hush that didn't comfort. It pressed, like weight, like warning. Marigold stirred behind him, wrapped in the wool blanket she never fully discarded even when she slept. She watched his back for a moment before speaking. "You feel it too?" He nodded without turning. "Something's wrong." She rose without a word and started dressing. Boots, coat, scarf. No panic in her motions, just readiness. She had lived too many winters beneath threat to need words to act. By the time the first gray light of morning bled through the clouds, the 3 of them were outside, boot prints cutting through fresh snow. Reuben joined them without asking, coat buttoned, eyes narrowed. His face held that same tired sorrow it always did now, but his shoulders had squared. "Where?" he asked. Marigold pointed to the west ridge. "You ever hunt this trail?" "Once," he said, "before it washed out." "We're taking it anyway." "I locked that," he said. Marigold didn't reply. They moved as one. Abram circled left. Marigold took the porch. Reuben followed behind, eyes wide. Inside the barn, the animals stirred but weren't panicked. The door hadn't been forced, just opened and left. But when Marigold reached for the rifle she always kept mounted above the feed bin, it was gone. She turned slowly. They've been inside. They swept the house next. Everything seemed untouched, hearth cold, dishes undisturbed. But when Marigold opened the drawer beneath the floorboard where she'd hidden her extra bullets, it was empty. They took what they needed, she said, her voice even, and they're not done. That night, the three of them didn't sleep. They sat at the table, maps spread between them, candles burning low. "Why now?" Abram asked. Reuben leaned forward. "Reuben Walton burned a barn and the law took him away. That news gets around. Makes some men want to test the next one, see how far they can go before someone else draws first." Marigold stared at the map, her finger tracing a rough line around their property. "They're not here for land. They're here for the fight." Abram looked up. "So what do we do?" "We give it to them," she said. The plan came together in silence. No grand speeches, no dramatic declarations. They fortified the barn first, nails driven deep, barrels stacked inside the doors, slits cut into the upper walls for sightlines. Marigold taught Abram how to aim not for the center of mass, but for the ground just in front of a man's feet. "Scare him first," she said. "Make him think about running." Reuben spent 2 days building what he called a fool's trail, tracks leading away from the cabin, footprints dragging a sled loaded with empty sacks to make it look like they'd fled with supplies. "They'll follow this first," he said, "if they're stupid." "And if they're not?" Abram asked. Reuben's face was grim. "Then they're already watching us." The storm broke on the 5th day. Not of snow, but of men. It started with a whistle in the night, long, low, like a hunting call, then the crack of glass. The bottle Marigold had set on the west post shattered by a rock. 3 shadows moved along the eastern fence line. Another 2 crept up from the creek bed. They weren't wearing badges. They didn't shout. Just crept in like wolves with dull teeth, hungry and quiet. Marigold took the roof, Abram the barn. Reuben stayed in the cellar hatch, rifle aimed at the side trail. The first man reached the porch, boot creaked. Marigold fired. He dropped. The second bolted and was caught by Abram's warning shot, which kicked up snow near his feet. He ran. Then the rest charged. Gunfire tore the night open. Smoke and heat spilled from the windows. Bullets pinged off tin and splintered logs, but the 3 inside held firm. Abram hit one man in the shoulder. Reuben winged another across the calf. Marigold dropped her rifle to reload and hurled a lantern at the east approach. Flames lit the snow like sunrise, driving the attackers back. One man made it to the barn. He slipped through a side crack and got within 10 feet of Reuben's position. The 2 locked eyes, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Reuben stood. No rifle, just his fists. The man charged. Abram heard the struggle before he saw it. Wood cracking, flesh hitting flesh, a grunt of pain. By the time Abram reached the hatch, Reuben was on the floor, bleeding from the mouth, but the other man was unconscious beside him. Marigold swept through the final clearing with practiced aim. The last 2 men turned and fled into the dark, rifles clattering behind them. When silence returned, it wasn't peace. It was exhaustion. Abram slumped against the barn wall, breathing hard, ears ringing. Marigold moved through the snow like a spirit checking bodies, tying the ones who still breathed, burying the ones who didn't. Reuben sat on the porch, cradling his side, blood dripping into the snow. "You good?" Abram asked. He nodded once. "I earned it." They didn't sleep, not that night, not really. They just sat in the kitchen, bruised and alive, the fire burning low. Marigold wrapped Reuben's ribs with a torn sheet, silent as always. When she finished, Reuben said, "You think they'll come again?" She paused, then said, "No, not after this." And when she looked up at Abram, there was something different in her eyes. Not fear. Not even relief, but something close to peace. You're not just surviving anymore, she said. You're standing. He met her gaze. So are you. She gave a small smile. I always was. Outside, the snow began again. Soft, gentle, like something finally exhaled. The snow fell easy now, slow and soft, like the land itself had grown tired of harshness. A thick silence blanketed everything by morning, not the kind that comes before danger, but the kind that settles after it. Abram stood on the porch, coffee steaming in his cup, his breath fogging gently in the cold. Behind him, the house was still. Marigold slept upstairs for once, not curled on the floor with her back against the hearth, but in Isaac's old bed, the one she'd scrubbed clean, patched the quilt on, and made her own in slow, quiet ways. Reuben remained in the cellar, not because he was unwelcome, but because he had insisted. Best I keep some space, he had said, half wincing, half smiling as Marigold wrapped his ribs the night before. I'm not trying to plant myself where I don't belong. And yet, he didn't leave. Abram sipped the coffee and stared out at the stretch of white beyond the fence line. Tracks from the night raid had already vanished, swallowed by the fresh fall. What remained were dense, faint impressions of struggle, blood darkened and iced over. But the fence was still standing. The cabin still held. The barn, scarred but intact, still gave shelter. And the people inside had not broken. Not once. The door creaked behind him. Marigold stepped out, wrapped in her coat, her hair braided down her back, steam rising from the cup she carried. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside him, eyes tracing the same landscape. They won't come again, she said after a while. No. You believe that? He nodded slowly. They came to take something that wasn't theirs. What they found was something they didn't expect. She turned her head slightly. And what's that? Abram smiled faintly. A woman with fire in her blood and a man who finally stopped running. Marigold looked at him for a long time. Her expression didn't change, but her hand found his, and they stood that way as the morning light spilled over the ridge, painting the snow in gold. Reuben emerged mid-morning, pale but upright, his coat bundled tighter than usual. He stood at the porch steps and looked up at them. I've been thinking, he said. Dangerous habit, Abram replied. Reuben grinned, then grew serious. There's a church 3 towns over, small one. Folks say the preacher's the type to take in lost causes. I think maybe I ought to see if that's true. Marigold nodded. You could stay. I could, Reuben said, but it wouldn't be right. I've seen what this place is. It's yours now. Abram stepped down and extended a hand. Reuben took it, their grip strong. You saved us, Abram said. Reuben shook his head. I paid a debt, there's a difference. He turned to Marigold. You're not what I expected. She raised an eyebrow. Most people say that. They're wrong. You're exactly what the world needs, just not what it knows how to handle. Marigold smiled, just barely. I won't forget what you did, he said. Make sure it means something, she replied. With that, Reuben walked down the trail. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and though his steps were slow, they were steady. He never looked back. They watched until the trees swallowed him. Inside, Abram sat at the table, thumbing through Isaac's journal. He'd read every page by now, but one entry caught him differently this time. March 14th. I don't know if she'll come. I hope she does. I hope Abram opens the door. He won't see it now, but he's the only person strong enough to carry a heart like hers. Maybe he'll remember I said that, maybe not. But I want him to know I never regretted choosing family, even when I didn't deserve one. Marigold stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. He knew, she said. Abram looked up. Isaac, he saw something neither of us could. He knew we'd fit. Abram closed the journal. I didn't think it would work, he admitted. Didn't think I had room for anyone after losing him. Thought I was too worn, too bitter. Then you showed up with that coat and that rifle and said, "I'm your wife now," like it was a truth and not a decision. Marigold walked toward him slowly, each step deliberate. She stood behind his chair and rested a hand on his shoulder. "I didn't say it to be clever," she murmured. "I said it because I meant it." He looked up, and for the first time he saw it, truly saw it. All the pain she carried, the roads she'd walked alone, the doors that had slammed in her face, the hands that hadn't reached back. And still she stood tall. Still she loved in her own quiet way. Not with flowers or songs, but with action, with presence, with the simple refusal to leave. "I'm not good at saying the right thing," he said. "You don't have to." He stood, reached for her hand, and placed something small into her palm. A ring. Simple, worn, his mother's. "I know it ain't much," he said, "but I'd like to try again, proper this time, not just inherited, not just surviving, chosen." Marigold stared at the ring for a long time, then slipped it on without a word. It didn't quite fit. Her fingers were larger than most women's, but it didn't matter. "Looks better on you anyway," he said. They stood there, two people the world had tried to break and bury, holding something fragile and unspoken between them. Not a promise, not yet, but the start of one. Spring came late that year. The thaw was slow, reluctant, but it came. Sap ran in the trees. The creek roared louder each morning. Birds returned to the fences. And Abram and Marigold planted new rows behind the barn, seeds she'd brought in a pouch from wherever she'd come from before. They worked together. Not because they had to. Because they wanted to. And sometimes at night, when the stars hung low and the fire burned slow, Marigold would hum a song neither of them knew the words to. Abram never asked her to stop. They didn't talk much about the winter. But they remembered. In the way their hands found each other without thinking. In the way the porch light was always left burning. In the way they never locked the door again. Because they had something now. Something stronger than survival. Something deeper than protection. Not just strangers bound by inheritance and hurt. Not just a man and a woman joined by circumstance. But two hearts, bruised and stubborn, that had learned to beat in rhythm again. Chosen.